Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Intersections of Our Lives session as a part of Netroots Nation's conference. My name is Lexi White, and I am the Director of State Policy and Advocacy with In Our Own Voice, National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda. We are a national and state partnership of Black women-led reproductive justice organizations across the country, whose work centers the lived experiences of Black women, femmes, girls, and gender-expansive folks in the ongoing policy fight to secure reproductive justice for all. And I'd love for my colleagues to introduce themselves before we dive into our presentation.
I'll go first. Hi, I'm Jennifer Wang. I use she, her pronouns. I am the Chief Strategic Partnerships and Research Officer with the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, and our mission is to build power with Asian American and Pacific Islander women and girls.
Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Champlin. I use she, her pronouns, and I am thrilled to be here with my colleagues in Intersections of Our Lives. I work with the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Justice that works along Latinx communities to build power, health, dignity, and justice. Great to be here.
Thank you. I'm going to begin today with a video from Intersections of Our Lives, which will tell you a little bit more about our collaborative, a collaborative between National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, In Our Own Voice, and National Latina Institute for Reproductive Health. This is a collaborative that has both national and statewide presence. And so we'd love to start with this video just to introduce ourselves a bit more.
The Intersections of Our Lives is a collaboration between National Latina Institute, In Our Own Voice, and the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum. It is a vision for a world where we work together because we are only free as long as all of us are free. Essentially what we're saying is if you come after one of us, you come after all of us.
And what the intersections are is looking at the commonalities that we have. What do we face in terms of barriers to being able to determine if, when, and how to create a family?
Las leyes han cambiado.
You can see your screen.
El gobierno necesita ciertas cosas. Siempre hay los puntos donde cada
Screen is
tipo
not showing for me to share.
I apologize.
No problem. Sounds great.
Conference without a little technical difficulties.
We're going on without a hitch. All right, let me try this one more time.
Yeah, it disappeared from the left here for me. I can't see it to make it live. Haha, there it is. There we go. Now there's no sound.
Latina Institute, In Our Own Voice, and the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum. It is a vision for a world where we work together because we are only free as long as all of us are free.
Essentially what we're saying is if you come after one of us, you come after all of us.
And what the intersections are is looking at the commonalities that we have. What do we face in terms of barriers to being able to determine if, when, and how to create a family?
Las leyes han cambiado y cambian según el gobierno necesita ciertas cosas y siempre hay unos puntos donde cada tipo cultural, cada grupo cultural ha tenido el mismo tipo de problemas, ya sea de sus derechos de inmigración o sus derechos de sistemas reproductivos o sus derechos como inmigrantes, y el poder ver ese tipo de unión es sumamente poderoso.
Reproductive justice is an intersectional concept. It's a human rights concept that says there are all these different pieces that impact on the lives of women of color.
I am not a woman on Monday, an immigrant on Tuesday, a mom on Wednesday, right? Like I'm those things every single day of my life, all of it.
This is about building a grassroots movement of women of color who can say to both parties, we matter. our voices matter, our lives matter, and that you cannot ignore us anymore.
I often travel to Washington, D.C. for meetings, and oftentimes the halls do not reflect the color of our country. They are much whiter, much older, and much more male dominant than what I would see out on the streets.
We're really thrilled to be able to come together for the first time in this historic gathering where we have 300 women of color, trans, gender nonconforming communities coming together to fight for reproductive justice. We're bringing the stories, the voices, the experiences, and the solutions of our communities to members of Congress.
The issues that we're raising during our meetings, visits with legislators and their staff, are on the HEAL Act and the Each Woman Act.
The reality that brings us all together is our universal need for healthcare and our access to our needs, such as abortion care. We want Medicaid to be able to cover that because there's so many people across all races, across all ideologies that are low income, that can't afford it, who should be able to afford it because their lives, their entire lives could be impacted by that one decision.
The best part of this advocacy day was watching Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley and Congresswoman Veronica Escobar give inspiring speeches where they encouraged our communities to lift their voices.
We shake the table. We call the question. We are the preservers of democracy. We are the truth tellers. We are the seekers of justice. And so today you honor that long tradition.
My big hope is that people who got to know each other this time around will go back to their states and keep that going.
My advocacy is going to look different on so many levels because I have the opportunity to sit at the table with other women of color and share our experiences. So it's easy for me to bring their stories back to the legislators I speak to either change or create policy that's going to impact all of our lives and not just my own. I recommend joining this coalition of women of color because first off, we're badass and we can't do it without you. We need you. Remember, one voice, one sound. We create power when we're all together.
Okay, thank you for patience, everyone. We are going to dive into our presentation. So that video was from a recent advocacy day where our members from across the country all came to DC to meet with legislators to talk about the issues, shared issue priorities for our communities. Now we're going to talk a little bit about our most recent poll. And I'm going to invite Jennifer Wang back, who's the Chief Strategic Partnerships and Research Officer with NAPOF, to give us an overview of our 2020 polling data.
Thank you so much, Lexi. I remember that day. It was in fall of 2019, and I think about that day frequently. But when I watch that video, the thing that strikes me is, what my boss Sungyeon said. Like when we walk the halls of Congress, which many of us used to do frequently, you just don't see what you see when you're out on the street and in your own community. It's night and day what the people that you see. And so I want to give you all an overview of polling data. One of the things that our 3 organizations collaborates on is a project to show the growing power of women of color voters. And our purpose is to hold our elected officials accountable to our needs, our specific needs. Just a couple of figures. In 2020, women of color voters actually grew by 10%. Now, this is one of the fastest growing voting blocks in the nation. And women of color voters, because of our growth, played a huge part in the win of President Biden and Vice President Harris. So, we really wanted to dig into the why. We sponsored a nationwide poll to understand what motivated women of color to turn out and vote, not just, what they were experiencing in 2020, but more specifically the issues that we cared most about. I don't think this is going to surprise anybody, but we were highly motivated to turn out to vote in the 2020 general election. Almost 9 in 10 women of color voters agreed that the stakes were too high in this election not to vote. We had all just seen 4 years of the previous administration. We knew the impact that it was having on our lives and our families and the community's lives. And so we turned out in record numbers. But we didn't turn out without some challenges. We found in our poll that 2 in 5 women of color voters faced challenges while voting. This is actually up 8 points since 2018, and 2018 was the last poll that our 3 organizations collaborated on using voter turnout data from the midterm elections. So I think people's predictions about the past election in 2020 was right. People face challenges, and these challenges were at a higher level than in the midterms. 19% of the women of color we spoke with were asked to show ID at the polls, and 11% saw disinformation on social media, and again 11% faced very long voting lines. We all remember the news articles about people waiting in line endlessly to vote on that day in November. But despite the challenges that we faced at the polls, people were clear. 90% of women of color told us that they wanted to see more women candidates running. 85% said that they wanted to see more candidates of color running for office. And in addition to just who we want in office, women of color voters were very clear with us that they wanted to see people in power using an intersectional approach. 81% of women of color told us that they really wanted their elected officials to understand how their needs differ from white women and men of color, right? So, how our race, ethnicity, and our gender meet and intersect to create societally imposed barriers, right? We as voters really wanted our elected officials to take that into account and to understand our different needs and priorities. Next slide, please. Thank you. So wanted to dig into a little deeper into reproductive rights and health. All 3 of our organizations use the reproductive justice lens to work on reproductive rights and health. Now, this is the lens that you all heard about in the video, where we as a value firmly believe that when pregnant people can determine if, when, and how they want to have children and start a family, it will create ripple effects throughout their lives, their families' lives, and throughout the community. So digging deeper into reproductive rights and health, coming out of the 2020 elections, women of color voters were very clear with us that they preferred language around reproductive rights to center women having authority over their bodies rather than keeping abortion safe and legal. Now, if you're new to this area, or if you're just, if what's going on in Texas is piquing your interest at this point, this is actually a huge distinction. Safe and legal is an old concept that language is frequently used in the United States to talk about abortion. Some of you may remember the slogan that abortion should be safe, legal, and rare. Well, it turns out that women of color voters actually don't love that language. And instead, 3 in 5 think it's extremely important to ensure that we have authority over our bodies and our lives, while less than half of us think it's extremely important to keep abortion safe, legal, and accessible. And so here we're seeing that women of color voters really value an expansive understanding of the concept of reproductive rights and health over their lives, over their bodies, as opposed to this very narrow way of thinking about abortion, which is just that it should be safe, legal, and accessible. 86% of women of color voters want their politicians to respect bodily autonomy over reproductive health. Again, that is expansive. Bodily autonomy is about a lot more than keeping abortion safe, legal, and accessible. And notably, 92% of Black women who polled the highest on this statement agreed on the concept of bodily autonomy being really important for their elected officials to understand. Of course, this doesn't mean that women of color don't support abortion. We do. 2/3 of us think that abortion should be legal in all or most cases. And notably, that was a 12-point increase for Latinas and the Latinx community since 2019. And like I said earlier, this expansive understanding, this expansive definition of valuing what reproductive rights and health are more broadly to us is resonating with 8 in 10 women of color. So 8 in 10 of us believe that there are expansive benefits to controlling our reproductive decisions. AAPI women were most likely to call out specific benefits like, if I had the ability to control if, when, and how I start a family, then I will have increased access to education, or then I will be able to parent my existing children in healthier ways, for example. I'll turn it back over to Lexi to talk about highlights in the poll important for Black women.
Thank you, Jen. So one of the things that really stood out from the poll, particularly for Black women, this go around, versus back in 2018 when we did the previous poll, Black women voted overwhelmingly this go around on a need for change. And we also did see a significant increase in optimism about the direction of the country. That certainly makes sense to us, given how eager our communities were for a change coming out of the previous administration. More notably, 66% of Black women, up 5 points from the last time we did this poll, believed that pregnant people should be able to access abortion in all or most cases. And 90% wanted elected officials to know specifically how white supremacy impacts their lives. In fact, 93% specifically noted the need for congressional leaders to address the impacts of anti-Black racism on their lives. And I think it's important to flag that those numbers were highest amongst 18 to 24-year-olds, high-income earners, postgraduates, and Black folks living in the Midwest. And then there were a number of issues that stood out as most important that Black women respondents to this poll flagged were most urgent or most pressing for Congress to take action on. Those items included ending discrimination against people because of their race, ethnicity, culture, or immigration status, reforming our criminal justice system to operate more equitably, ensuring that people with pre-existing conditions can still get still receive and access health insurance regardless of those pre-existing conditions and without discrimination. reforming policies that specifically address police violence against Black people, addressing barriers to accessing the ballot that make it harder for certain groups of people to vote, and ensuring access to clean water. And we continue to see, I would say, even in our national poll of just Black women or Black voter respondents, we've continued to see the importance of access to clean water amongst Black women voters. We had another poll that told us that 1 in 3 respondents had reported having dirty tap water come out of their faucets at home. And so we continue to see this theme coming up, and this point on clean water also came up in our previous poll. We also polled folks on the impacts of COVID-19 and issue priorities in order to recover from the impacts of COVID-19. For Black women respondents specifically, highest ranked issues that coincided with impacts of COVID-19 included having experienced mental health impacts, so having had reporting having had their mental health suffered, having lost a family member, and having missed a bill payment or having had trouble paying bills because of economic insecurity that resulted from the COVID-19 pandemic. This coincides with a number of the more detailed economic constraints that Black women respondents raised in reporting on how they'd like to see Congress take action around the COVID-19 recovery. And the highest percentages were for a number of these economic response issues, particularly the importance of Congress providing financial assistance for families, including rent assistance, unemployment benefits, and access to food stamps, raising the minimum wage, and then direct cash payments to taxpayers. So these were where we saw highest rates of change, but you see a consistency at 60% for a number of these other economic recovery items. For example, financial support for small businesses, child tax credits, and support for more affordable and accessible childcare, assistance for people with their student loans, as well as placing a pause on evictions to prevent homelessness during and in the aftermath of COVID-19, just to name a few. Of course, access to emergency paid sick leave and family leave was also ranked pretty high. Going to pass it back to Jen for some highlights for AAPI women.
Thank you so much, Lexi. So again, this is a continuation of a 2018 poll, but we worked hard to include the changes that have been happening since 2018, including, as Lexi shared, the effect of the pandemic on our communities. So first and foremost, we were, I think, saddened to learn that 1 in 3 Asian American and Pacific Islander women shared with us that their mental health had suffered during the pandemic. I don't think that that's a surprising figure, given what the community has been going through at the intersection of racism, sexism, xenophobia, hate, and violence. But it was, I think, hard to see that figure. We, I think, not so different from 2018, found that AAPI women deeply understand reproductive justice values, I mentioned this earlier, we won't dig super deep into it, but AAPI women poll the highest in being able to articulate the specific benefits of reproductive freedom and autonomy on other areas of our lives, including creating healthier families, improving the quality of a child's life, providing greater financial security, increasing economic and educational opportunities for the pregnant person, etc. I just want to note here very specifically that this is the very definition of intersectionality. What you're seeing here in the poll results is demonstrating that Asian American and Pacific Islander women, and of course women of color broadly, really through our lived experiences are showing us through this poll that not only do they understand intersectionality, not only living these concepts in their everyday lives, but they're actually articulating them through our poll results. Oftentimes a stereotype that I hear about our community is that Asian American and Pacific Islander people don't support reproductive freedom or might be conservative in our beliefs about these topics, but more than 8 in 10 women of color voters agree that pregnant people should be able to have an abortion without fear or arrest or investigation. And it actually turns out that East Asian women in the United States are most likely to agree with that statement. And so that is directly contrary to the stereotypes about our community, which I'll be honest, I hear all the time from my own community and from my family, but the poll results don't lie, the stats don't lie, and here you have information directly from the 2020 election showing us that in reality, AAPI people, in particular East Asian women in the US, actually strongly support pregnant people's access to abortion without fear, arrest, or investigation. This won't be surprising to anyone who's been following the news, but the pandemic had increased instances of racism and violence against AAPI women. In our poll, we found that 2 in 5 Asian American and Pacific Islander women nationwide had been personally affected by these instances of racism and violence. Oftentimes, it was really at the intersection of race and gender, where AAPI women would hear racist and sexist remarks in the same sentence, for example. And so that's just another way that we are living out intersectionality and really want our elected officials to understand that intersectionality. And I'll end with just a repeat of a stat that we found and shared earlier in this presentation, but almost 80% of AAPI women agree that we really want our elected officials in power to understand how our experiences and needs and values really differ from white women. I'm going to turn it over to Emily to discuss highlights about Latinas.
All right. So I think in this polling, we've all been kind of highlighting how intersecting barriers to healthcare, basic healthcare coverage has really, and the constants of white supremacy and patriarchy has led to COVID-19's impact being incredibly disproportionate for women of color. And when it comes to Latinas and Latinxes, one of the communities that remains one of the highest uninsured rates in this country, almost 8 in 10 Latinas and Latinxes said that they were personally impacted by the pandemic, with 1 in 4 having a family member die from COVID-19. And that's extremely unacceptable. And it's because there are policy barriers in place based on immigration status. There's a lack of access to adequate health education and vaccines because of language barriers. And so this is access to healthcare remains an extremely high priority here. And also when we're talking about reproductive health priorities, it's extremely clear that Latinas and Latinxes want politicians who support people making their own decisions about their reproductive health. And similarly to what Jen was explaining, there's this stereotype that doesn't seem to go away that Latinas and the Latinx community don't support abortion care. And the polling here shows that that couldn't be further from the truth. When asked questions that actually resonate with people and don't use this safe and legal or pro-choice versus pro-life framing, then I think you can see how Latinas and Latinxes actually care about these issues. And it's actually that half of Latinas, Latinx voters believe abortion should be legal in all cases. And that's a 14-point increase from our 2018 polling. And there's also 7 in 10 Latina and Latinx voters that believe that there are personal and societal benefits to accessing abortion and making your own decisions about your reproductive health. And I think, similarly to AAPI women, Latinas and Latinxes reported 8 in 10 agree that a pregnant person should be able to have abortion without a fear of arrest or investigation. And so when you look at policies like SB 8 in Texas, that is directly contrary to what Latinas and Latinxes have said that they want, the kind of policies and healthcare access that they want. So in 2020 voter turnout, I think it was obvious that women of color were the crux of that election. And while white women's turnout only grew by about 6%, Latinas and Latinxes grew by 24%. And when asked why, it was clear that they just felt it was too important not to vote in this election. And what I find really interesting is that when asked about like the top reasons that they really wanted to turn out and vote in 2020 is immigrants and the treatment of immigrants had a huge impact on that decision. COVID-19 and climate change, racial tensions and the division that Trump created in this country, and to bring a change in the way Black people were treated. Again, Latinas and Latinxes view the world with this really intersectional frame because they walk through the life at all of these intersections and really want their politicians and their lawmakers to understand that better.
So we wanted to dive a little deeper into this distinction between what Emily just talked about, this concept of keeping abortion safe, legal, and accessible versus the concept of ensuring that women, pregnant people have complete authority to make decisions about our bodies and our lives. You'll see on the left-hand side, again, this is a poll about this is a poll where all the respondents self-identified as women of color. You'll see on the left-hand side that 84% agree with keeping abortion safe, legal, and accessible. But if you dig into the distinction between extremely important, very important, somewhat important, and so on and so forth, you see that 46% of women of color voters agree with this, that it's extremely important to keep abortion safe, legal, and accessible. Now, if you compare that dark blue result, the 46%, to the right-hand side figure, where you can see that 60% of women of color think that it's extremely important for women to have complete authority to make decisions about their bodies and their lives, that's a pretty stark figure there. And you see an overall higher figure at 92%. But when you dig into the extremely important versus all of the other results, that's really where you see a huge change. And if you look at the not at all important or not that important, you also see pretty big decreases on the right-hand side. So far more likely for women of color to agree with this intersectional broad value that we should have complete authority to make decisions about our bodies and our lives. There's some increases. So if you look at the charts on the bottom, you can actually see the change between 2018 and 2020. You'll see that Black women had a huge jump into the extremely important category at 69%. That's the highest change, or the highest figure rather. Yeah, wanted to note that. And then, as Emily mentioned, there's the increase among Latinas and Latinxes, a 10-point increase there, which we've put in fuchsia. We're gonna turn it over to Lexi to there it is, to help us walk through some examples of how we can digest and use the poll results that we're sharing with you today to make real-time and important changes to the message that you want to send in your work, if you intend to center and reach women of color voters.
So we're going to jump into a Jamboard to do some work together, because we know trainings much prefer to be interactive than a bunch of people talking at you. So I am going to pop into the chat just now. That is a link to our Jamboard. And I'll share my screen. All right, so if you join us over in this Jamboard, we'd like to work through some of these messages, discuss maybe how they're flawed, and don't use this intersectional framing that's so important. All right, so first up, I kind of wanted to talk about how the term bodily autonomy really forces us to think about reproductive rights in a broader reproductive justice way. It forces us to question more, okay, well, who has bodily autonomy? Do they have access to coverage? Do they have physical access to be able to get the care that they need, right? Bodily autonomy versus just pro-choice or the legal right really forces us to think about all of these different factors. So right now, in the news, we're hearing a lot about the Hyde Amendment. So communities of color, people with low incomes, the LGBTQ community, people with disabilities have had and continue to have their bodily autonomy abused by government actors at every level. So looking at the narrative around the Hyde Amendment, which is a policy blocking federal funding for abortion care in the Medicaid program, which has been passed and approved every single year since 1976. Currently, policymakers are negotiating whether to include the Hyde Amendment in the Build Back Better Act, which could expand the Medicaid program in states that have refused to expand it under the Affordable Care Act. So I wanted to pull out some of these phrases that I've heard in the media around this topic. And I wanted to see, from your all's perspective, what does bodily autonomy mean for the rely on Medicaid for their health insurance? So when we're looking at responses from people who are anti-abortion care, right? They say, we don't think abortion is good for unborn children or their moms. And when the government funds something, you get more of it. So that's one of their arguments. Another argument that you hear a lot is that removing the Hyde Amendment would overturn decades of bipartisan consensus that taxpayers should not foot the bill for abortions. So if you're new to Jamboard, on the left-hand side here, you've got sticky notes. You can type in your response here in all these different colors and give your feedback. You can also use a text box, or if you're more visual, you can add an image. But go ahead and add your thoughts. And what do you think about what does bodily autonomy mean for those who rely on Medicaid coverage for their insurance? And we'll dig into that a little bit more. Also, if you're more comfortable putting your response in the chat, feel free to do that. If it's not affordable, it's not accessible. Absolutely. I love that. That just gets to the core of it, right? If I can't afford abortion care, what does a legal right mean to me? I think something that's not really understood a lot when we're talking about the Hyde Amendment is who's actually affected by the Hyde Amendment, right? So people in the Medicaid program, specifically low-income folks. So this policy targets people with low incomes. And due to systemic racism and redlining in housing, that we know that people in Medicaid are more often women of color. Half of Medicaid recipients are women, and the majority of those women are women of color. So this is a disproportionate impact on women of color. Also, 3 in 10 adults with disabilities rely on Medicaid coverage. So what does that mean for people with disabilities, right? How does their bodily autonomy get respected? Any other thoughts here on how overturning decades of bipartisan consensus strikes you? I know Jen and Lexi have feelings. I have strong feelings about that too. I think often in these conversations, right, we have policymakers who are talking about the tax burden, the burden on the taxpayer. But that's really just a construct, right? We spend trillions of dollars. Ooh, I really like this. Yeah. We're only here with this policy and this conversation because there's a long-standing legacy of refusing to center people of color in policymaking. And that's why the Hyde Amendment still exists over 40 years later. Thank you so much for sharing that. So I'm going to move us into kind of the next part here. So when talking about Medicaid disproportionate impact on people with disabilities specifically, I think there's a lot of co-opting of disability justice in order to push a really anti-abortion agenda. So what often ends up happening is you have policymakers rooted in paternalism making these policy decisions for instead of with communities with disabilities. So I wanted to go over some statements that I found here. Representative Estes and his colleague, Senator Inhofe, talked about a bill that they were introducing that bans abortion on the basis of a disability. It's tragic that in the United States, babies are being targeted simply because they have one more chromosome. This legislation is about ensuring the rights of individuals with disabilities are protected. And then down at the bottom, you have responses from disability justice advocates. Corey Dunn said, "We would never think of using limits on someone's bodily autonomy to protect our rights. We didn't ask for this," which really struck me. We didn't ask for this is literally paternalism in policymaking, right? You didn't talk to communities, you didn't find out what they needed. So what are your reactions to these? I also really like Rebecca Coakley. I think she's an amazing advocate, definitely somebody to follow. And her quote here really ties the whole framing of bodily autonomy together, whether it's forced sterilization, experimentation, eugenics, or treatments to keep us small and manageable. Removing our right to control our bodies, our personhood, has been common practice by the well-meaning, non-disabled public for centuries. And so when you're talking about an abortion ban based in paternalism, policymakers are forgetting that people with disabilities need abortion care too. And they're doing a lot of assumptions and acting on behalf of communities. Any other thoughts there? All right, I will move us along. And I think, Jen, you're up.
Thank you, Emily. So we've talked a lot about this dichotomy or this binary, right? Like you're either pro-choice or you are anti-choice. But that actually isn't an expansive or oftentimes helpful dichotomy or binary to be thinking about reproductive freedom or abortion access with. And something that Emily said really gets to the heart of this issue, right? So if you are pro-choice, if you have a law that is pro-choice, what does it actually do to ensure that somebody who can't pay hundreds of dollars for an abortion can actually access or use their choices? So here you have two concepts, right? My body, my choice, which we are hearing more and more these days on another issue, and that is vaccines. But it's long been a pro-choice slogan, right? You hear it all the time. I've even heard it in the last couple of weeks since SB 8 went into effect in Texas. Like I'm hearing a lot of my body, my choice nationwide. But, I wanted to use this as an example in showing how it can be a limiting concept. It doesn't always humanize people and communities in the way that a different framework might. And so I defined the concept of reproductive justice in blue on the right-hand side, and I'll just read it out loud. It's the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, have children, not have children, and parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities, right? You might ask yourself, like, oh, that's too big. It's not a cute slogan. Well, yeah, and there's a purpose behind that. And the purpose behind that is it is confronting systemic problems, right? My body, my choice is not a systemic, my body, my choice in one given moment is not a systemic solution to problems that communities are facing. When we did this activity with another group, someone actually wrote in the sticky note down in pink that my body, my choice makes certain people invisible. Lots of people don't even have choices, including those under conservatorship, right? And then in Emily's example, I think Rebecca's statement was really powerful, right? Like oftentimes you have people who are like, fine, your body, your choice, unless you have a disability or unless you are poor or unless you are, it just leaves open all of these lived experiences that are actually more systemic than you may think they are. Someone else said, my body, my choice is too simple. It's individualistic. It doesn't encourage people to consider the community. Contrast that with over on the right-hand side, the definition of reproductive justice actually talks about the well-being of children, right? Abortion is not only for people who want to be child-free. It is for people who want to be child-free, but it's also for people who are already parents. And in fact, if you look at the figures around who actually gets abortions, by and large, the vast majority of people who go and get abortions are already parents who are wanting to parent their existing children in safe and sustainable communities. And so, if the spirit motivates you, you can add some sticky notes here, answering the question, what do we gain from having an expansive talking point like the one on the right, as opposed to a limiting, narrow concept, that someone else said it better than I. Reproductive decision making is then reduced to what seems like a moment in time, when in fact there are so many choices we make and need to make without interference or coercion over our lives. I'll just point out one sticky note that I circled. Without context, my body, my choice could be about anything. And that person was right, because as you can see, people, largely white conservative people, are co-opting that to essentially tear down our public health in this country. And so we actually gain a lot from having an expansive view about bodily autonomy and community. I know we are low on time, so I'm just going to go straight to Lexi so that Lexi can talk about ageism, reproduction, and abortion-centric ideals.
Awesome. Thank you, Jen. Thanks, Emily. So one of the, I think, most timely issues that we're navigating in terms of how we shape an effective and comprehensive narrative around reproductive justice is how we talk about young people, specifically how we talk about and message around teen pregnancy and young people's reproductive decision making and their human right to have full agency over their bodies and reproductive decision making. So I have a few examples here. The first example here comes from, and these are not, I will preface with, these are not RJ messages on this particular screen, and we've asked folks in a few different sessions to help tell us why. But the first quote actually comes from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. I believe it's the Office of Population Affairs, one of their annual teen pregnancy prevention weeks, where they say, teen pregnancy prevention is more than sharing reproductive health resources. It is about connecting youth to services and opportunities that will help them reach their full potential. When we work to prevent teen pregnancy, we help youth achieve their full potential. And I have a few sticky notes on here. In the interest of time, I'm just going to point out how folks have said they might improve this message or what some of the limitations are. And really, this quote makes it sound like young people don't really know how to think for themselves. Perhaps they might need services, but ultimately the framing here is around prevention and preventing them from being able to make that decision. And it kind of suggests that, perhaps someone who is a teenager who becomes pregnant, may not be able to ultimately reach their full potential. And that is certainly not messaging that we would suggest or use in centering reproductive justice. I'll give other folks opportunity if they want to comment on the Jamboard, around what else is problematic about this message. Please go ahead and do so. And while folks do that, I'll move over to my second example. This comes, I believe this quote was last year. Senator Flores, Republican from Miami, said this after a bill was passed to impose parental consent requirements for young people in the state of Florida. And just for a little bit of background, there are currently 38 states in the US that require parental involvement in a minor's decision to access abortion care. 37 states also include a judicial bypass procedure where young folks are forced to go not only obtain parental consent, but then also go before a judge to be deemed fit to make this decision for themselves. And in 21 states require one parent's consent, And there are 3 states that require 2 parents to consent to a minor obtaining abortion care. And so this particular elected official said, "The way I see it, it's just a forced conversation on something that will forever and ever change several people's lives. And that's what we're asking for. Can there please be a conversation so that the little girl doesn't have to go through this by herself?" So my question for viewers is, what assumptions is this quote making about young people and their right to bodily autonomy? And I'll share some of what previous participants have said. It assumes that young people looking for resources are quote unquote little girls, right? Not young adults, not young people capable of making decisions about their bodies. It certainly, I think, makes this claim that this isn't a decision that someone who's a young person would be able to make for themselves. And it also, I think in a lot of ways assumes that folks, that young people, have this kind of a dynamic with their parents where, they need to get consent or even, have close proximity to parental figures who could make this decision for them. It makes a lot of assumptions around whose lives will be impacted in ways that take away from the agency of the young person who may be pregnant. So that's just a few notes. And what do you all think? Do I have time for one more, or should we go into some Q&A?
I think if there are questions from folks, go ahead and pop it in the chat. But yeah, Lexi, this is great. Let's do some more.
Okay. Can you go to the next one, Emily? And this is an example of a more comprehensive, message through an RJ frame. BIPOC adolescents, including LGBTQ+ young people, must be able to access culturally competent and gender-affirming sexual health education and have full agency in decisions about their sexual and reproductive health, including pregnancy and parenting, without coercion or shame. And can you go to the next example, Emily? Okay. Actually, can you go to the next one? So talking about pregnancy-related care and experiences. This quote comes from Caden Coleman, who's a trans father of 2, who was featured last year in an Insider cover on Today, where he spoke openly about a number of traumatic experiences that he navigated in terms of discrimination from medical providers around both of his pregnancies, where he was denied access to pregnancy-related care, like birthing classes, chest feeding classes, and postpartum support groups, because they were labeled women's spaces. We know, 50% of trans folks have reported needing to teach doctors how to use more trans competent language. But in this quote, Caden Coleman says, "There was a lot of questioning about my identity, a lot of misgendering, being told I shouldn't be in spaces I was seeking care from because they were considered women's spaces. I was offered an abortion a ridiculous amount of times." And one of the problematic things we've identified about this dynamic is that it makes a lot of assumptions about who is supposed to get an abortion when they become pregnant. It makes a lot of assumptions around whose identities deserve the right to comprehensive pregnancy-related care and reproduction. I wish we could go deeper on this. We will leave you all with a link to the Jamboard so you can contribute your thoughts. We'd love to hear your feedback but we only have 1 minute left. So I will ask if anyone else has questions in the chat. And is that it?
I think I'm looking in the chat. There is a distinct frowny face from the experience you just described. Agreed. Deep frowny face. There's also, I popped a link to the polling results on our beautiful website in there if you want to check out more of the detail of the polling. But I'm not seeing any questions, so thank you so much, everyone.